right, good evening, everyone. Ready to get started? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Gilson. I'm one of the assistant principals here at East High School. I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming tonight. A lot of you are in the beginning or in the middle of the college process, which is of course exciting. You're going to see the campuses, academics, sports, all those great things. One of the things that's sometimes not so great is when you start looking at the tuition. So our job tonight is to kind of help walk you through that and hopefully be able to answer some of your questions. So we're going to quickly turn it over to Ms. Matane. She's one of the school counselors here at Eastchester High School, and then we'll get started with our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Gilson. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. Such an important night. We're so happy to see you here. I want to give a warm welcome to Mr. Dan Robinson. A little bit about Dan. He's a financial aid professional with over 30 years of experience in the student aid field. He is currently the campus director of financial aid at Pace University, the Pleasantville campus, and he's been there for the last 18 plus years. Prior to Pace, he worked at Adelphi University and Iona College. We're so happy to have you here tonight, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. There's a lot of information we're going over, and just so you know, I know exactly what you're going through because I have a high school senior at home myself, going through the same process of looking at colleges, Common Apps, essays, recommendations, so I know exactly what you're going through. So tonight we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics. Some of them may seem a little overwhelming. If you have some questions, if you want to ask during the program, you can stop, but if the questions get too much, I'll just wait till the end, get them all in, but go through it as quickly as possible and as detailed as possible. First, we're going to discuss some of the most common terms within the financial aid. What is financial aid? What's the cost of attendance, expected contribution, need, etc. So these are the common terms you expect to hear throughout the process. So first is what is financial aid? Basically, it's money to help pay for your child's college education, or for the students in the room to help pay for your college education. And where does the money come from? What is it made up of? And how do you go about being awarded? So the first term you're going to hear for a lot of schools is their cost of attendance. And the cost of attendance is made up of several components. There's the direct cost, which is what the school is going to bill you for, so that's your tuition, your fees, your room and board. Those four figures are the ones you really want to pay the most attention to. Because again, that's what you're going to be billed for from the school. Also is the books and supplies. Some schools will actually bill you for books and supplies, some schools will not. They'll actually be considered the indirect expenses, which of course you're going to incur while your child's in school, but you're not charged directly for them. So you have to get your child to and from school either a few times a year, or if they're going to be a community student, every day. And then their personal expenses. They're still going to need, the everyday clothes, etc., that you're going to have to pay for. But again, the tuition fees, room and board is what you're really going to focus on. What schools use to determine financial need is a figure from the pre-application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, known as the expected family contribution, or EFC. It's a misnamed term. It doesn't matter what the cost of the school is, that expected family contribution stays the same. It's a constant number that's used to determine financial need. So you take that cost of attendance figure, subtract out that EFC, and that's what your financial need is. Some schools also use an index from the CSS profile, which I'll get into in a little while. So here's just an example of how you see the EFC staying constant depending on the cost of the school. The need level goes up, but that EFC figure stays the same. But when you look at cost of attendance, as I said, don't look at the overall cost of attendance. Look at tuition fees, room and board, then determine how much true need you have after all aid is awarded. So what type of financial aid is there? There's need-based financial aid and non-need-based financial aid. Need-based is usually in the form of free money, and non-need-based aid could be in the form of loans and work. So four basic types of aid. The ones on the right are the ones that your students really are going to be striving for, and you as a family be striving for. First off, scholarships. Most schools consider students for academic scholarships based on their admissions application, whether the school looks at both test scores or GPA only, but most schools being test optional these days. Some schools will also look at talent, athletic, artistic, musical, whatever it might be. But the initial scholarship that most schools offer are based on the high school academic record. As far as grants go, most schools have grants that are need-based. There are some outside grants that may not be need-based from organizations that you may be applying for through different local community groups, etc. but grants are also free money. So that's why the right side of this pie chart is where you're looking at. As far as the left side, self-help aid, student loans. We've all heard enough about student loans in the news the last couple of weeks, the last month or two, loan debt forgiveness, etc. But student loans can be considered financial aid because they're government funded. So that's why they're considered aid even though it's a loan. And same with work study. If a student participates in the federal work study program on campus, they're being paid primarily from government funds as opposed to funds from the school. And that's why it has to be considered financial aid. Now, where does all this money come from? 5 main sources: the federal government, state government, the colleges themselves, and then private sources, and possibly even your employers. So the federal government is the largest source of financial aid out there, because again, every student who applies for the FAFSA gets sent to a school and is considered for federal financial aid, regardless of the school you're attending. It's primarily based on need. There's 1 or 2 awards that are not based on need. And the FAFSA is the form that's used each year, and each of the awards has their own eligibility requirement. So these are the main 7 federal aid programs that are out there. The 2 that are not need-based are the Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant and the TEACH Grant. The Iraq-Afghanistan grant is for students who would have lost a parent in post 9/11 conflicts in Iraq or Afghanistan. They get the equivalent of a full Pell Grant regardless of that EFC figure. And the TEACH Grant is for students who are going to school to become an educator, an education major, but not all schools participate in this program. So even though your child may want to go to a school, the goal of becoming, a high school teacher, if the school participates in the TEACH program, you may qualify for the $4,000 TEACH grant. However, if the student doesn't meet all the requirements while in college of remaining an education major, and then after graduating, teaching in a designated teacher shortage area as designated by the Federal Department of Education, that turns into a loan. So that's why a lot of schools choose not to participate in that program, because they found that a lot of their students who started getting these awards, before they even got to their sophomore year or junior year, they've changed majors. Now they have additional debt. Or once they graduate, they may not start teaching, they find a different career. So a lot of schools don't participate, but if your child is looking at a school to become a teacher, ask the question if they participate in that program. All these federal aid programs are determined by filing the FAFSA, which I'm going to get into in great detail in a moment. The other awards that are out there, the federal Pell Grant, has a direct correlation to the EFC. Each year, the government determines what level of EFC is eligible for a Pell Grant. Usually that figure is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5,700 on the index, and it's a sliding scale. The minimum Pell Grant this year is $268, I believe it is, and the maximum award is $6,845. So the lower the EFC, the higher the Pell Grant. The other free money that's up there is the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, commonly known as SEOG, or some schools say FSEOG. This is a pot of money schools receive from the government to award to their Pell Grant recipients. Not all Pell Grant recipients. The school determines, set their own criteria, which Pell Grant recipients can also get this SEOG funds. And usually it involves filing deadlines, how much need the student has, whether sometimes it takes it to the academics as well. We want to make sure it's given to the students that are going to achieve. So each school sets their own criteria for determining the FSEOG. Now, the federal work study I touched on briefly before, and then the 2 loan programs. The federal direct student loans, these are loans for the students themselves. First-year students are eligible for up to $5,500 in federal loans. Now, this could be broken up into 2 types of loans based on need. If there's demonstrated financial need after all other aid is awarded, students could qualify for a direct subsidized loan, meaning while the student's in school and their 6-month grace period, the loan is interest-free during that time. So there's no responsibility to pay anything until that 6-month grace period ends. At that point, interest starts accruing. If there's no demonstrated need, the student would get the unsubsidized loan, where it has the same rules. You don't have to start paying it back until 6 months after the grace period, but interest starts accruing as soon as the loan is dispersed. And you can pay any of these loans early. There's no penalty for prepayment. Finally, the Federal PLUS loan program. PLUS stands for Parent Loan for Undergraduate Students. So this is a loan you as parents can take out for your student's education through the federal government. Now, the government advertises this loan as a low-interest loan to help families pay for college. 7.5% isn't exactly a low-interest loan. They also take off right from the top a 4.25% origination fee. So you're not even getting what you're asking for. They're taking that right off the top. So it's a good last resort for some families. It's a credit-based loan, but it's a very simple credit-based loan. All they look at is your past 90-day credit history. They don't look at your income. They don't look at your debt. They don't look at if you're working. It doesn't matter how much, if you're working or not. If you have a good credit report over the past 90 days, you'll be approved for the loan. It's kind of scary when you have to go and pay it back a few years later. It's modeled after the unsubsidized loan, where it starts accruing interest as soon as it's dispersed, but you can defer it until your child graduates. New York State aid, I'm going to come back to the New York State aid, so I'm going to go into that in more detail because they've added so many programs, so I'm going to skip over the state part for a moment. Now, the next main source of financial aid are the colleges themselves. If the child's looking at one of the private university or college, most likely the aid they're going to receive is coming from the school and from the other sources. Because most private schools know they have to compete with state schools to get you to a closer number that you could afford. So schools usually determine their awards based on academics and need. Some schools have their own programs for loans and work study. Not too many do anymore, but they do have some schools that will lend you their own money. The lending rules have changed, so a lot of schools have backed out of that over the years. Schools will use the FAFSA and go to CSS profile to determine your need level, and deadlines are very strict for these programs. If the school has a deadline, kind of like the admissions deadline, schools have a FAFSA deadline or CSS profile deadline. You want to make sure you meet that. Now, on the outside world, there is money to be had. Probably a little early to start the scholarship search, but it's coming up very quickly. Usually right around the new year is when it opens up. But start looking now to see, are there any foundations or organizations in the community that offer some scholarships? I was talking to one school a couple weeks ago where there was someone in the district offered, a charity in the district offered $5,000 to one student, $5,000 to one student each year. It's a nice scholarship. Most of them are smaller amounts, a couple $100, maybe $1,000. But look around, any charitable organization, religious organizations, civic organizations, to see what they have to offer. I imagine the guidance office probably has some information for you as well on that. Are students on the Naviance system? Yeah. I know Naviance has a scholarship search as well, so utilize that. If you're on the College Board website, they have a scholarship search as well. And the most reputable ones, along with FastWeb, which is on the handout. And again, start looking now. For those parents in the room whose child are still high school juniors, you can start looking. You can't apply for anything yet, but at least you'll know where you'll be at this time next year. Now, as far as employers go, we see in the financial aid office, we get applications from parents whose students are going to college, where their employer is offering them a benefit that they'll pay a certain number of dollars each year. It usually ranges from like $1,000 to $2,000 a year because their child is a student at our school. Not all employers do this. We see mostly from families who belong to a union. Is one of the union benefits they get. But also for employees for children. If your child's working, if they have an employer, one of the, not just like a babysitting job, but they're working for a corporation of some sort, tell them to ask to see if there's any education benefit. We had a family friend of ours across the border in New Jersey who worked at ShopRite. And she worked at ShopRite starting in the sophomore year of high school straight through college. They paid $1,500 a year towards their college education. Okay, I'm not sure if they still do that, but again, you never know to ask. I know I always hear McDonald's is good like that too, but again, if the child's working, if they're not working yet, if they start looking for jobs, that's a question they should ask when they start working. So, October 1st. It's now almost the end of October. There's an important date. Again, personally speaking, that's the day my daughter turned 18, so it's nice that it coincides. That's the first day to file the FAFSA. And I fed my daughter that, and as soon as the clock rolled to midnight, we were doing the FAFSA, and she wanted no part of that. So we did wait a couple of days before we did it. It's also the first day to file any of the financial aid forms. But we're going to focus on the FAFSA first, because that's the most common one that needs to be applied for at every school. Now, before you file for the FAFSA, anyone who signs the FAFSA, the information's on there, needs to have what's called an FSA ID. This is basically your electronic signature for anything with the federal aid program, FSA meaning Federal Student Aid Administration. So it's your ID. Now, the parents in the room have filed the FAFSA in the past for another child. You have an FSA ID already. You do not need a new one. Each student needs their own ID, however. So if there are multiple children in college, parent has one, each child has their own. It's standard ID. It's going to ask for your name, address, social security number, date of birth. They do a cross-reference to Social Security Administration to make sure you say who you say you are. And it takes about 24 to 48 hours to validate. So try not doing this the same time you're sitting down to file the FAFSA. Give it a day or two beforehand to make sure you get it done. And you know, when I had my daughter do her FSA ID a couple of weeks ago, I got that typical teenage eye roll saying, there's 4 challenge questions, okay? So be prepared. So the FAFSA itself, first word being free. It is a free application. There's no need to pay anyone to help you file it. It's a free application for federal student aid. It collects demographic and financial information for both the student and parent. It comes up with that ESC calculation we spoke about before, which is used to determine aid, and it's available both in English and Spanish. Unfortunately, I was at a session earlier this week at a conference, and despite the government promising us additional languages, they have not done so yet. Again, beginning October 1st is when you can file it, but I recommend checking every school your child's looking at to see what their deadline is, to make sure the FAFSA is in by that deadline. I've heard many horror stories over the years from families that missed the deadline by a day or two, and their child lost out on significant financial aid. There you go. So what other information is needed? For the student, you're going to need the student's legal name and social security number. If you're unsure, take out your child's social security card. I know if I filed my FAFSA as Dan Robinson, it will reject, because my legal name is Daniel. It doesn't understand shortened names. We've heard cases where sometimes you may not even realize, but the social security card, the name can be reversed. And you know, you've gone through your child's life this whole time not realizing it until the FAFSA rejects because there's a name mismatch or a date of birth mismatch. So you want to make sure everything is accurate as it appears on the social security card. If your child has changed their name over the, at any point in time, if it hasn't been changed with the Social Security Administration, you need to put the name as it appears on the Social Security card, not the chosen name. It also asks about citizenship status. FAFSA can be filed by any U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen, meaning anyone who has an alien registration number. There are some cases of students who are refugees or asylum that may be also able to file. And it also asks the child's marital status. It asks about the parent's marital status later, but the general information for the student is the child's marital status. And I'd like to think or hope that most of the children that the parents out here are still unmarried. You never know. I've come across a few over my years. So the detailed information is going to ask for the FAFSA as far as dependency status. Most students come out of high school are dependent upon their parents. It's common sense. The dependency question is up to the age of 24. So they ask if you were born before a certain year. There's 13 questions on dependency status. Most of them are simply no's because is a child attending grad school? Are they a veteran? Are they currently in the military? Things like that. Those are the simple ones. It gets a little tricky. There's one question they actually updated the wording on this year about a child being a legal dependent. Now, all our children are legal dependents of ourselves, but they changed the word to say, is the child a legal dependent of anyone other than their biological parents? So if a child has court-appointed legal guardianship, they would be considered independent. Other grounds of independence is if the child's at risk of being homeless. So, we have a lot of parents and students come to us and say, I turned 18, I moved out, I'm on my own, I'm independent. Unfortunately, for FAFSA purposes, you're not independent because you're still under the age of 24. Now, if there are some cases where it's a little tricky, you may have to work with the school your child's applying to see if there is dependent or if there's any guardians in the room or foster families. Things get a little tricky on some of those. I spoke about legal guardianship. That is different from custody in New York State. There are two different terminologies. If you have custody of someone, that doesn't mean it's legal guardianship unless it's court-appointed with those terms, legal guardian. Now, the meat and potatoes of the FAFSA is the financial information. So what's needed? It's going to be income tax information from 2021 tax return for both the student and parent if the student filed. It's going to ask some questions, and I'll get into the details of the FAFSA in a moment, but it's going to ask some questions about whether or not you received any federal means-tested benefits such as SNAP or WIC, those type of programs. It just asks if you're a recipient. It doesn't ask the dollar amount. It's also going to ask about your investments in assets. This is where it gets a little specific, and so I don't really like to, I can memorize this, but I like reading it just to be sure. When they talk about assets or investments, what they're looking for is real estate other than the home you live in. Your primary residence is not reported on the FAFSA. You have the house down on the shore, that's reported. You have investment property, that's reported. And it's the value minus any debt. Also included are trust funds, money market funds, mutual funds, CDs, stocks, stock options, bonds, other securities. Also included are education savings accounts such as Coverdale's and 529s. Now, if a lot of parents have 529s for their children, the value of the 529 for any child in your household, the total amount combined, is what gets reported on the FAFSA as a parental investment, not as a student investment. Even if it's in the student's name, it gets moved to the parent side. So the government does their calculation of that EFC. Anything on the student side, they say, okay, a majority of that should be going towards their education, and that just boosts up that EFC figure. On the parent side, they know you have a household to run. So anything you list, they put all these protections in to say, okay, you're this age, you're closer to retirement, so more of your available money shouldn't be going towards education, it should be going towards your retirement. The calculation's about 8 pages long for the EFC. So any of those funds get reported. If the 529 is held by someone outside of your house, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, it does not get reported on the FAFSA, at least not this year. What happens is, if that parent, aunt, uncle, grandparent pays for your child's education this year, it'll have to go on next year's FAFSA as untaxed income for your child, because it's a gift. But as long as they hold it, so if someone outside of your household has the 529, try letting, don't use it until the child's, a senior. So that way it doesn't affect you throughout the college years. But the 529, if you use it each year, it's not held against you, it's already reported as an investment. The other bit of information that gets reported is untaxed income. As I did mention before, what's not an investment also is your retirement fund. The value of your 401k, 403b is not reported as an investment. What is reported is your pre-tax contribution. So that information is found on box 12 of your W-2, where you contribute pre-tax to your retirement fund. That's considered part of your investments. But the retirement fund itself is not. Yes?
So when I use that IRS tool thing, so that will take it in there?
The IRS data retrieval tool, which we'll be speaking about now, it does not take in the information from box 12 of your W-2. Yes?
For the 529s, if you have multiple kids, are you just talking about the portion for the one child that we have included, or all?
All your children, because being that those funds are commutable between your children, they want to know the total value.
Got it.
So we mentioned the IRS data retrieval tool. This is something that's been, since it came into existence about 8 years or 9 years ago now, has been very helpful to most families. When you fill out the FAFSA, it's going to ask you information from your tax return, such as your adjusted gross income, your tax paid, and about 6 other categories. If you have your tax return next to you, it'll tell you what line to pull it from. Okay, go to line 7 of the 1040, subtract line 2 from Schedule 2, add in line 1 from Schedule. You know what? It's a lot of math. You don't have to worry about making mistakes. If you're eligible to use the IRS data retrieval tool, it'll pull the information from your 2021 tax return directly into the FAFSA. You'll put all the information in that only that's needed for the FAFSA. It comes through as masked. You cannot see the information that comes through, and that's for your protection. A few years ago with the data retrieval tool, they actually had to freeze it for a while because they thought there was a bug where people were able to access someone else's taxes by filing a fake FAFSA. So they cleaned all that up. But one of the things they did was any of the information that gets transmitted is not visible to the person filing the FAFSA. So it's voluntary to use the data retrieval tool, but it is recommended. First, because you don't want to make mistakes of using wrong figures. Second, the government selects 1/3 of all the applications filed for each school to go through a verification process. But we have to collect your tax returns if you don't use the data retrieval tool. We don't want to collect tax returns. We don't want that information wandering around our office. Yes, we get it electronically, but still, that's your personal information. So we don't want that. Use the data retrieval tool. You may still get selected for the process, but then it's just submitting a form to us. So it's a lot easier. Also with the data retrieval tool, the one little trick on it is if you took money out of a IRA or retirement fund and moved it to another account, so you had a rollover, it doesn't pick up the rollover. But what it will do is if it notices it's one of those fields, it'll ask you, was this a rollover? And if it was, it asks you to put in the dollar amount. So if you don't put that in, you can't go back and correct it. If you forgot to do it, you have to have someone in the financial aid office make that correction for you. So if you do have a rollover, make sure that you report it on the FAFSA. That question, you answered that question. Yes?
So I'll just make it short, because I literally just did this, and I just called FAFSA.
Yes.
Because the data retrieval tool was not working, and it was driving me out of my mind, I was not using it. But they said that it doesn't always work, it's glitchy, it's a high volume right now, and it's
Right.
not working. So she said, put it in manually,
The,
instead of using the
they,
data.
really? Okay, that's,
I literally just called.
wow. So it's probably a timing thing. It's been working really well. It's the first I'm hearing of it. And I was just up at our statewide conference this year. We've heard of other issues the government's having with the debt forgiveness, which I think is probably going to tie into it. But if you can use the data retrieval tool, definitely do it. But otherwise, that's why have your tax returns handy, just in case for that problem. There are some cases where you're not allowed to use it. If you file taxes as a family, if it's a married family, if you filed separately, and married filing separately, you can't use the data retrieval tool because it only can pull in one tax return. It cannot pull in multiple ones. Or if there's a conflict. If you reported yourself as married but filed your taxes as head of household, that doesn't jive, so it's going to say, wait, you can't do that, put your information in yourself. For the most part, hopefully by the time everyone else gets to it, it's working. But again, it's a government system every once in a while, and sometimes if they know they're going to be down and not working, they'll put a message up there that the system will be down, you're not be able to do anything during this time period. But usually that's like Sunday mornings between 2 and 5 a.m., which hopefully no one's doing their fast at that time, but they might be. Yes.
So, a question, for the retirement fund, they don't need to know what's actually in there, but what I put in every year?
Your pre-tax contribution.
Okay.
Only the pre-tax contribution.
For the year.
Right.
Okay.
Which when you get to that question, it'll tell you it's box 12 on a W-2 and a certain code. Box 12 has different letter codes. It's like it's A, B, C, and E, and there's a couple other ones, but it'll tell you exactly which codes to use. And the total of the
So it's box 12 on the
W-2, correct.
I gotta go back and read you again.
Yes.
So does that mean post-tax is ignored? So you do the rocks?
Correct. So looking at you're making a pre-tax contribution because that money's, you're doing the right thing because you're getting saving you money in the long run, but that's money that you could be using to pay for your child's education. They're looking at it. So, but thankfully they're not counting the tax, the retirement fund. That's the main thing. So actually, I have this slide related. I should have moved this slide. So I did my daughter's FAFSA. I didn't realize they moved the question. Where the college information actually goes before you do the financial information now. But you can list up to 10 colleges on the FAFSA. Now I know when I started doing this 20 some odd years ago, there was 6 on the FAFSA, 6 colleges, and we were like, who actually applies to more than 6 colleges? Now it's like, okay, who applies to less than 20 colleges? So this is where it gets a little tricky. Because when you file the FAFSA the first time, you put on the 10 schools your child's looking at. It's going to ask you for the name of the school and whether or not they're going to be living on campus, off campus, or with parents. If you're unsure, always choose the on-campus option. Because on campus, your cost of attendance is going to be higher from the start. It's going to give you more options for financial aid. Where, I'll use my school as an example because we're close by. So, okay, you're at Case, only a few miles away, you're going to be a commuter. File your FAFSA, you can send you your financial aid package. You don't have any grant money because your cost of attendance is low because you're not living on campus. You come to orientation in July and realize, oh my God, I want to live on campus. Now you change everything, your cost of attendance is higher. That grant money we had in November, December this year, we may not have in July. It sounds bad, but for schools, it's easier for us to take money away in July and August than to add money in July and August. So it's easier to switch from a resident to a commuter. So always default to the resident option, unless your child's going to a school that doesn't have housing, then obviously you have to choose one of the other choices. With the colleges, if you have more than 10, once the FAFSA gets finalized and processed, you're going to have to go back in and take 10 off, put the new 10 on. And if it's more than 20, go in and take those 10 off and put the next group on. You gotta make sure every school gets the FAFSA though. So after you do it the first time, first go around, you get the processing notice from the federal government. The schools have access to it through the government system. But for peace of mind, I'm the type of person, I'm gonna call that school to say, do you have my child's FAFSA? Because I need to make some updates to it. Before I make the updates, make sure they have it in their system. Some schools may not have it yet. A lot of schools wait through October before they download their first batch, so they may not be able to give you a definitive answer yet, but soon after November 1st, they should be able to do so. Yes?
This may be silly, but if we have twins and they're both graduating at the same time, does it tend to apply for both, or is it 10-10?
Each child needs their own FAFSA.
Got it. Okay.
So, so you can do it multiple times. If both children applying to more than 10 schools, then you're gonna have to do a lot of juggling.
But the question could be on when they measure it against me, right?
Correct.
My financials against their two FAFSAs.
Right, so each FAFSA will have their financial information if they file taxes, and your financial information.
Got it.
Yes.
So
Yep, ma'am.
question, on the FAFSA, I don't remember seeing it, but during the height of COVID, we were able to take out a hardship loan from your 401k under the CARES Act. Does that have to somehow go on there because that's stuff I'm paying back?
It doesn't, some of that information is supposed to carry forward from the tax return and use a data retrieval tool, and a code indicator gets sent to the schools. Well, so it looks like they made some information that looks discrepant, but if that code indicates that, we know, okay, this is a COVID-related, was it
Yeah, 'cause
something,
it-
the K form, I forget what it is, but then the school may ask for additional information, but at least they'll know that the red flag that's there isn't something that you made a mistake on, is that it's one of those seasonal type of things, for lack of a better word, each year. It's not gonna be, it should be that this year's faster than what you're filing, so last year that'll happen. After that, it should be going away. Those who took the money from retirement funds and over a 3-year period instead of a one-time hit, that's how it's getting reflected on your tax return. So once all the information's in, you're gonna need to sign the FAFSA. When you log into studentaid.gov, the student's gonna log in using their ID. They've already signed their FAFSA technically. That's when they sign in to start the process, it's already signed. When you get to the signature page, that's where the parent has to sign it. So if it's a 2-parent household, only one parent needs to sign. So either parent can get the FSA ID. I always recommend if it's a 2-parent household, both parents get the ID. It's not going to hurt you. If you ever want to take out that parent loan down the line, use that ID to sign it as well. And an ID is good for 20 years, so it's easier that way. If for some reason you can't sign electronically, you had trouble getting the FSA ID, or it's not linking up, you can print out a signature page. You can still submit the FAFSA to the government. They'll start the processing. They won't finalize it until they get to the signature page, which will be about a 2 to 3 week delay. The electronic process takes 2 to 3 days, if that. If you still want to do the old-fashioned paper FAFSA, which you can do, you go to the studentaid.gov website, you print it out, you can fill the whole thing out by hand. Don't recommend doing it. So you're looking at a good 2-month turnaround time if you're done. Because I think less than, I said well over 99% of them are filed electronically.
So on that form, it had a list of states, and New York was like, I want to say March 1st for the deadline. But you're saying now the colleges have their own.
Yes, the March 1st deadline for New York State, that's actually for New York State aid. So for the federal form itself, each school has their own specific deadlines. Yes, and most of the deadlines for schools, the private schools are earlier than the state schools. So state schools don't start that processing until February. Private schools start that processing. I've known, some of my daughter's friends have already gotten notices that they've been, their admissions process is complete, they're admitted to schools. Financial aid and student follow. If you do an early action, early decision, most schools want to get the financial aid package out at the same time or very close to it. So that's why the deadlines are very close to the early action, early admission, early decision deadlines as well. Yes?
I filled out the FAFSA, I haven't submitted it. An important question on there is about if you're unemployed. It's called, are you
Dislocated worker, yep, coming up on that one.
So I was filling it out, I didn't see that question. I completed the FAFSA, it gave me to review what I did. In the review, I saw the question. I tried to go back and correct and fill it out,
Right.
and you can't do it. I called numerous times. Finally, someone told me, and then I reset, I did the whole thing over again, and I was really careful about watching for that question, it's like number 80. They're not numbered when you fill them
No,
out.
I'm on that.
So I'm looking for it and I couldn't find it. That's when I knew something was wrong. So now they tell me, finally, I got to one person and she said, what we can do, she said, it's a bug in the system, they're trying to fix it, and they don't have a solution. In the meantime, she said, what you can do is call the financial aid administrator of the
Right.
college and let them know, if you submit your form,
Yes.
call the college, let them know that you need them to fill out my form saying yes.
Have his information on there to kind of get that certificate? I don't know.
If your son lives with you, then technically it has to be you on the FAFSA.
Okay.
But what I'd recommend, some of those outside scholarships, make sure that he's looking for scholarships for students of disabled veterans. New York State, even though New York State has some scholarships for disabled veterans as well, I'm not sure all the rules on those. If it has to be the parent, the custodial parent, it may be the non-custodial parent as well. So you may want to contact New York State for further information on that. I'll get to the state aid in a moment. Also, if your husband has any veterans benefits left over, it's one thing I did speak of. If there's any veterans in the room and you have your veterans benefits available to you, they may be able to be handed down to your child. So check with the veterans offices, the VA, and then each school has their own veterans offices as well. So if you need to make corrections, including corrections is changing colleges, what you want to do is go back in to the FAFSA. There's two ways of doing it. Go back into the first page and say you want to make a correction to the FAFSA, you could do that. Or something actually I just literally learned this morning at my conference, I kid you not, is if the student goes onto their FSA webpage and logs in and they go into documents, they click on their FAFSA, there's a section there for corrections. And it's supposedly simpler than going in and doing the FAFSA correction page. So if you go to studentaid.gov, your child logs in, look at the documents that's out there, they open up their FAFSA, they'll be able to, it's sectioned out, and you just choose the colleges, and you click on that, and then just change the colleges right there. It has to be signed again by both the student and parent. Any corrections has to be signed by both. So special circumstances, we just touched on this briefly before. As you can tell, the FAFSA doesn't explain real life situations. It's pretty clear cut. It's your income, it's your assets, it's household. It doesn't get into everyday life. So there are certain conditions schools will determine to say, you know what, we can make adjustments based on your behalf, your current situation. I would say start by sending a simple letter to the school without documentation, because each school does things a little differently. So if your child's applying to 10 schools, you want to send them 10 different letters, you don't want to send 10 copies of all your personal information. Send a letter explaining the situation, and the college get back to you to let you know, one, yes, we can pursue this, or no, we can't pursue it. But two, if we are pursuing it, this is what we need. And each school makes their own decision on what they'll pursue. You can send the same exact information to just 2 schools. One will say yes, one will say no, and that's within their right. The only thing that the federal government makes schools do is to consider any special circumstance request. We don't have to act on it, but we have to consider it. Now, what are these are the most common special circumstances that we see. The two of them are combined uncovered medical expenses and dependent care. If you care for anyone, anything not covered by insurance. So if you have, for your children's medical expenses, your own personal medical expenses, or if you have other needs, you have a parent that may be in an assisted living facility that you're paying for, or you have a child in a special needs school that you're paying for, some schools will consider that to do a special circumstance review. Most schools will, in all honesty. I can't say all, but most schools will. If a parent passes away, unfortunately, that's of course that's across the board. There's different circumstances for that school. You have to make adjustments to the FAFSA. School to make the adjustments to the FAFSA accordingly. That's when you may need to send in some tax returns, because we end up doing is backing out the parent's information. Loss of employment. This is the most common one, because you're filing the FAFSA based on your 2021 income. Anytime between now and September, when your child's starting college, your employment can change. If that happens, send a notice to the school explaining your situation. Pretty much all schools will take a look at this and say we should be able to do something, unless the loss of employment is voluntary. If you're retired, some schools will say, okay, you're retired, you have less income, send me the information. Other schools will say, you chose to retire, it'll be reflected in your taxes in subsequent years. So again, that's what's a little different. Involuntary loss of employment, or what FAFSA normally calls dislocated worker. then all schools, that's one thing the government did say, if the parent is unemployed, you really need to make the adjustments. So if you are unemployed, hopefully it's not the situation that, many others in the room, but send the school the notice and we'll let you know what we need to make those adjustments on the FAFSA. Now, secondary school tuition, obviously your child's in a public school, but you may have another child in a private school, both actually elementary or secondary. Some schools will consider that. If you send them a copy of the bill for their tuition, they'll say, we may be able to make adjustments. I worked at 3 different colleges. One of the schools I worked at, one of my prior schools, said, you're choosing to send your child to a private school, we're not gonna take into consideration, because there's a public school you can go to. The other 2 made that consideration. And then finally, if the student for some reason cannot obtain parental information, that's usually when we hear from the guidance office to help us out to get the student through the process. But there are other special circumstances that, if you're going through, send a letter to the school. Again, they'll let you know if they can move forward with it. Oh, the one thing I did leave off was divorce. Divorce isn't that, if you're currently divorced, it shouldn't be an issue. As long as the tax return is filed, matches the filed status on the FAFSA. One of the questions for the parents on the FAFSA is your marital status. If you report as married, but submit, you actually reverse that, hold on. You report yourself as divorced or separated, but your tax returns come in as married filing jointly or married filing separately. That's conflicting information. You're saying one thing here and one thing there. Could it be true? Yes, because these are 2021 taxes. Sometimes that needs to be explained. If the situation is where you can't truly explain it, we may need to make adjustments to either your taxes or your FAFSA. We've seen that in the past. Hopefully I'm not offending anyone in the room that may be tax preparers, but we see a lot of families who file as head of household when the parents are still technically married, which is not a proper filing status. A lot of tax firms may use that to help families get additional refunds, etc. from the government. When it comes to the FAFSA, that sets up the biggest red flag we see. Is parents report themselves as married, and one of the parents filed their taxes as married filing jointly, married filing single, married filing separately or single, the other one files head of household. If you're still married, you can't do that. So hopefully your tax returns are correct. We actually, financial aid officers have to actually tell parents to go back and refile their taxes, do an amended tax return. We don't like doing that. So in divorce situations, if the divorce happens after the fact, between now and while your child's in college, and your taxes are filed as married, school's gonna ask for significant documentation. They're gonna say, okay, do you have divorce proceedings, court documents? Do you have proof of separate residence for both parents, separate W-2s showing different addresses, utility bills, etc. Said hopefully it's not the case, but if it does, you should be prepared to submit a lot of paperwork. So I'm going to get to the New York State programs now. So New York State, as New York State residents, I imagine everyone here is a New York State resident. As long as you're a resident for at least 1 year, you'll be eligible to apply for New York State aid. These are the major programs offered to New York State residents. And I'm going to not all of them, I'm going to go over the big 3 or 4. But the state requirements first off. You have to, both the student and parent need to be a resident of New York State for at least 1 year. The student has to attend school within New York State in a matriculated program. And each of the programs has their own eligibility requirements. Now, New York State TAP, Tuition Assistance Program. I received the TAP award when I went to college however many decades ago, so it's been around a long time. What hasn't changed is the maximum award from TAP. When I started this profession 20 years ago, it was about 20 plus years ago, the maximum award is $4,800. So you can see it's gone up less than $1,000 in the past 20 years. But it's there. This is actually one award that has a magic number tied to it. If your New York State net taxable income is $80,000 a year or below, which is equivalent to about $100,000 federal adjusted gross income, your child would qualify for a TAP award. The minimum award is $500, maximum award is $5,665, and it's a scale. The lower the net taxable income, the higher the TAP award. New York State net taxable income may be on the lower side, but if you have untaxed New York State pensions, it'll be held against you, just so you know. So even though your net taxable income may look low, but if some of your pension funds are non-taxable, they will count that against you. It depends, the amount of the award also depends on the cost of the school and the tuition charge. So if your child is to go to WCC, they get less of an award as if they went to Sarah Lawrence, much more expensive. It looks at financial data for student and parent, whether they're dependent or independent. New York State, I said the federal government dependency status till 24, New York State questions it till 35. So, you know, so, I can't judge. My wife lived at home until she was 35, so I shouldn't joke about that. It also looks at other family members that are registered for college as well, whether it doesn't have to be in New York State, whether they're in college, and it's combined taxable income. Now, the big Gloria program for New York State that came about a couple of years ago was their Excelsior Scholarship. This is for students studying at a SUNY or CUNY school whose parents make less than $125,000 federal adjusted gross income each year. It covers full tuition only, not fees, not room, not meal plans, just tuition. It can be used for an associate's or a bachelor's degree, but there are two big, marks on this. The student must meet educational requirements each year of a 30 credit minimum. So most colleges have 120 credits to graduate, so it's 30 credits per year. New York State requires you to do 30 credits per year. If a child comes in at 28 credits, they keep the award from the year they got it, they don't get it the next year. So you want to be careful of that. A lot of first year students, 15 credits, that's what you're going to need each semester, but first semester, you know what, you're getting acclimated to college, and you don't want to take one less class, and you don't take 13 credits. You need to make sure that you make that up by the end of the academic year, whether it means going into January session, extra classes in spring, or possibly summer, if you want to keep the award in subsequent years. The other big catch to this award is that the same number of years that the student receives the Excelsior Scholarship, they have to live and work in New York State for the same number of years upon graduating. So if you got the award for 3 or 4 years, when you graduate, you get that great job offer in Stamford, Connecticut, and you take that job, you're now paying back those 3 years of your Excelsior Scholarship to New York State. So the goal was to keep the students in New York State in New York State. It also can mean that, okay, they got this nice job in New York that's close in payment, but I want to come back to home to live with mom and dad instead of getting my own apartment, because it's cheaper that way. So they may be coming back after college. So it's great that you're going to get the free tuition, but there is that back end just to keep in consideration. Now, New York State came up with the Excelsior. They also came up with something for the private schools in New York State, which is called the Enhanced Tuition Award. All the requirements are the same on the front end and back end, and the academic end. The two big differences: one, schools have to opt into participating in this program. And the last count, I think, was down to about 23% of the private colleges and universities actually participate in this program. It's dropping, yes.
So that is only for tuition, right? Not room and board, right?
Correct.
And also, is it all SUNY and CUNY schools?
Yes, the Excelsior is for all SUNY and CUNY schools, including community colleges.
Okay.
The Excelsior, yes.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, she can. So, question, because I see I made another mistake on the FAFSA, so I have to go in a third time.
Not uncommon.
Does that affect, because you know it's like first come, first served when it comes to the 8. So if I make corrections, does that affect any possible, negatively, if I go in and make a second correction or a third correction?
It shouldn't, because most schools haven't made their financial aid decision yet, so they're going to be doing it off the most recent FAFSA. But when it comes to deadlines, I can't speak for all schools, but most of the schools that I'm aware of, they're going to use the initial filing date of the FAFSA. So even though you filed the first one, say, on October 2nd, you have to make corrections now, and your last correction was made on November 3rd, they will still honor that October 2nd date. Most schools, I can't say all of them, but most of them will do that. So with the Enhanced Tuition Award, as I was saying, it's all the same requirements, but the two big ones, schools opt in, and the other part is the maximum award is $6,000 in state aid. So if your child's getting a $4,000 TAP award, they're only going to get a $2,000 ETA award. They're not going to get an additional $6,000. It's a maximum of $6,000 from the state. Reason schools don't like this, for other reasons, besides being an administrative nightmare, any of these awards, it's actually a 50-50 split. So if the child's getting an extra $2,000 to get to the ETA, $1,000 is actually coming from the school. A lot of schools have determined if it's coming out of our pocket anyway, why have the administrative burden? We'll just give the extra $1,000. It's a lot easier for us to do. So, but ask the question. If the child's looking at a school in New York State, you may qualify for this. Ask if they participate, because it is a separate application at the moment. Subsequent years, it shouldn't be. Yes.
Where do they find that application? Say, like Syracuse. Where would I find that?
If they, first we'd ask Syracuse if they participate, it may be on their website. if they participate in the ETA program. And if they do, then usually it opens up in January. When I learned this week, they haven't opened up the ETA application yet. It will be on the New York State Higher Education website, which is on the handout, hesc.ed.gov. The application will be there. At least for this year. Next year, the application should be clean and what we're learning. So both are good programs, but again, there's a little bit of warnings to both of them. The final New York State program, which is another excellent program, does not have a need component. This is strictly academic. If your student, I'm not sure if you do class rankings here, if you don't, New York State has a formula for you. But if your student's in the top 10% of the class and decides to major in one of the STEM majors, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, at any school in New York State, they will receive the STEM Incentive Award. If it's a SUNY or CUNY school, it covers the full tuition only. If it's a private school in New York State, the student will receive the equivalent of a SUNY tuition for that school. Now, this could be a big bonus for the student, depending on how the school processes this. If it's a private school, I'll use my school as an example, the students are awarded a $25,000 scholarship, okay, great. And they also a STEM major getting the New York State STEM Award for an extra $17,000 a year. My school won't reduce your academic scholarship. We'll stack it on top. Some schools will reduce the academic scholarship by the STEM award. So again, each school handles it a little differently. New York State doesn't have guidelines of what we should be doing. They just added private schools into this program 2 years ago, so it's still a learning curve for them. But again, it's based on academics. It has the same back-end agreement of working and living in New York State for the same number of years you're receiving it. It's a separate application done. Usually in the beginning of the year, it opens up on the New York State website. The other kick on this, you cannot take a gap year. It's only for students going directly from high school to college. And again, we're seeing more gap years in this pandemic years, where students take that year off before they're going. So it's something, if they're going to major in STEM in New York State and they qualify for this, and they want to talk the child out of taking that gap year, could amount to a nice scholarship for them. So New York State Aid is a separate application. What happens when you complete your FAFSA, it'll guide you to this page where it links you to the New York State Aid application. But also on this page, before I get to that part, right above it, especially the parent in the room who has twins, there's a question to transfer information from the current FAFSA you're working on to the siblings FAFSA. So this is a pop-up you get at the end. Depending on your browser, when you click on one, this pop-up may go away, it may not. If you have more than one child in college, choose the first one. Have the information from the FAFSA transmitted to the other child. It's a lot easier than, you always go back and do the state application.
Show me where you're talking about.
Right above the blue line, the top line, read out.
Transfer.
So, yep. So you see that, you click that one. If you only have the one child, you click on the state application, it'll bring you to New York State Higher Education's website, where you can start completing that. In the past, I'd say it's a quick process. Unfortunately, it's not any longer. You need to have your New York State tax returns handy, because they ask a lot more specific questions than they have in past years. So it's going to ask a lot of information will pre-feed from the FAFSA, but it's going to ask a few more questions about your New York State tax return as well. The final form, well, some schools have their own forms also. So forms, I'm speaking of the general forms across, but some schools, when I worked at IOTA 20 years ago, they had their own financial form on top of everything else. But some schools will require what's called the CSS profile, which is done through the College Board. And this is usually more the highly selective schools who are spending a lot of their own endowment funds. It asks more detailed information in the FAFSA. It's going to ask some of the same tax information, but it may ask for information if you're separated, divorced. It may ask for questions of the non-custodial parent. When you go to the CSS profile website, it'll list all the schools that the form is needed for. There's 5 different columns. Make sure you look at the right columns. The first 2 is the form is required for domestic students, and the other one's the form is required for international students. And I believe locally in Marist is the one school where the answer is different. They don't require for domestic students, but they require for international. This form costs $25 to file initially, and $16 for each additional one you need to file. So it could add up, especially if your child's applying to a lot of private schools that require it. It's going to add up the cost. So check to see if it's required first off, and then there's a column, third or fourth column in, if you're separated and divorced, it'll tell you whether non-custodial parental information is needed. Again, some schools want it, some schools don't. So it's a little more personalized than the FAFSA. It's going to collect more detailed information about your income. It's going to ask about the value of your home. It's going to ask about the value of your cars. It's also going to ask how much debt you have. So it looks at a more true picture of your everyday finances. I'm still looking at 2020 tax returns, 2021 tax returns, but again, looking at a more realistic picture, not just the snapshot of where things were on December 21st, 2021. There are waivers if your income's below 100,000 through the College Board website. They'll be able to guide you there. But the CSS profile, I've never worked, I must make a caveat, I've never worked at a school that required the profile. So, but the information that I have here is the generic information. Their website is actually very helpful. There's tutorials, like 10-minute videos that get you through the process. I've talked to many families that have filed it before. It takes about the same amount of time as filing the FAFSA, sometimes a little bit longer. I would say give yourselves a minimum of about, for the FAFSA, I'd say an hour, but you probably won't need an hour for those of you who've done it. Hopefully you didn't use the full hour. You can come back to 2. You don't have to do it in one sitting. But make yourself a cup of tea, cup of coffee, sit down when you know you have time to do it. When you have, as parents, when you have little distractions. I know that never happens, or it's at 2 in the morning on Sunday when the system's down. But try to get it done in one shot. Profile will take you possibly a little bit longer, so you don't have to do them at the same time. You can do them at separate times. But give yourself a little bit of time when you have a little peace and quiet. So now you got all the forms in. Schools have everything. Common App's in. Yes?
I just had another question about the Excelsior
Sure.
program. Can you still apply for like the TAP and the Pell? Can you still get grants and everything on top of that you can use towards the room and board or anything like that?
The only thing to be used towards room and board is Pell. Everything else is tuition specific.
Okay.
And actually for the Excelsior, you're required to file a FAFSA. So it's automatic.
Okay.
Yes?
Will you be speaking on out of the country, any, aid that you can get for colleges outside of our country?
For colleges outside of the U.S., each one, some schools, if they're affiliated with a college within the United States, they may accept the FAFSA. They may also accept the profile. But a lot of the international universities may have their own form you're going to need to complete. And if they're looking for you at what your income is, they may ask for your income already converted to whatever country they're in. Same thing as anyone here who has foreign income. If you do have foreign income, when you report it on the FAFSA, you have to convert it yourself. So you can't put it in whatever the monetary source is in that country. So everything's in. The students been admitted to the schools. The school's going to do, if there's any additional information they need, they're going to send you the request saying these are the documents we need. Most importantly, they're going to send you what's called a financial aid award package, a financial aid award letter, financial aid award notice. Everyone's a little different. How they send it, some schools are sending it by mail still. A lot are sending it email notification saying, congratulations, your financial aid award notice is ready. Click here, it'll bring a copy of it up. Some schools will have the student log into their school's portal and access it. Portal's a common way of doing it because it's most secure, being it's giving you some financial information. So on that award notice, what it's going to contain, it's going to have all the money your child's scheduled to receive. The academic scholarships, need-based grants, federal money, loans, work study, said everything actually. It may not include talent-based scholarships because, again, schools that have theater programs, you may have to pass an audition to get talent-based scholarships. Those auditions may not happen until January or February. You'd be admitted to the school with a basic financial aid package, but then you pass the audition, there's additional money there. The child's a student athlete. The financial aid package may not be ready by the time the coach makes the decision whether or not they're going to give your child athletic aid. Same with artistic talent or music talent. That portfolio may need to be submitted and reviewed, and that usually doesn't happen until a later date. So any of the talent-based awards usually do not appear on the initial application. Now, if your child's a recruited athlete, Division I, there's a good chance that you'll know that ahead of time anyway. It'll give you the breakdown of costs. It should break it down like I showed you before, so the direct versus indirect. As I said before, always focus on the direct costs. I'm sure many of you probably got the same mailing that I got from my daughter from college. Your mailbox is full every day with two things right now: political ads and college stuff.
Yeah.
One goes right in the box. So I got one a couple weeks ago from Boston University. you know. Good thing I was sitting down when I opened it up, so I knew it was expensive. I didn't know how expensive it was. But it was a nice, beautiful book on financial aid. I think that some of the money they're charging is to print that book. But it gave strict details, like November 1 was that deadline for all the forms, you know, and which is crazy. But, you know, it said $80,000 a year is that cost of attendance. But if you look at the tuition fees, room and board, they could add up to a measly $74,000, $75,000. But, you know, make sure you take out those indirect expenses when you're making that final decision. I like to recommend to families, whichever, you know, source you like to do, an Excel spreadsheet, you know, college name, direct expenses in one column, financial aid in the other column, you know, and total it out and do the comparison that way. You know, look at just what you're being charged. Don't worry about the indirect expenses. Yes?
I apologize for my ignorance as a mom of a junior, but when you get these financial packages, is that the same as acceptance at the school, or you still have to apply and get accepted to the school? They're
They
just
are
letting you
same.
know how much it's gonna cost if you should get accepted?
They are separate. Most schools will not put out a financial aid award notice until the student is accepted.
Okay,
So you do the admissions application, the Common App, or whatever school has the application, and then financial aid. You can file the financial aid form before your child's admitted to the school. So, you know, if your child hasn't submitted their application yet, you can still put the FAFSA on. The school will get a copy of the FAFSA electronically. They'll keep it in a suspense file of some sort until there's a match for it. So it's not like it's floating around in the, you know, cyberspace. Yes?
So then, is it even worth it to apply for financial aid if you're gonna get probably the absolute minimum? Will it affect your child's chances of acceptance?
Most common question I get. My job here is always to say, yes, file for financial aid. That's, you know, what we say to everybody. First I'll explain that part of it. I always say the FAFSA is a free application. Okay, so that's one thing. So all it takes really is time. Even if you don't think you're going to get anything from the federal government, I know some parents out there might say, you know what, I want my child to take out their student loans just to build a credit history, understand debt management, but eventually I'm going to pay them off anyway. You need to do the FAFSA for that. If you as a parent last minute need to, you know, your child decides in the spring semester, great opportunity, I'm going to go study abroad, I need $4,000 by the end of the week. You know, you may be scrambling for that. You can take the student loan out if your FAFSA is filed. You don't have to worry about filing it. You know, at least the first year, get the FAFSA done. You know, subsequent years, if you don't need it, fine. Some schools will require the FAFSA even if they're not giving you anything but merit aid. Again, I can't speak how it is now, but 20 years ago when I was at Iona, if you got $1 from them in any source of fund, you needed to have a FAFSA on file before they would disperse it. So check with the school to find out if it's required. The CSS profile, again, not all schools require it. I said the BU mailing I got, it said they meet 100% of need as demonstrated between a combination of the FAFSA and the profile. So the only way to find out if you have demonstrated need with them is to file it. Again, that's a fee involved with the profile. But again, schools are expensive. You know, if you have, you know, even if you have significant income, if you have more than, you know, one child, especially if you have more than one in college, that you may be able to qualify for some, you know, need-based aid or a grant or a possible scholarship. Now, I'd love to say all schools are need blind and they're going to base the admissions decision strictly on your child's academics, but there are schools that will not do that. They want to know that you can afford to send your child to their school. Or vice versa, they want to know that you're going to need someone, we want to make sure we like your child, we want to make sure we're giving them the maximum aid so they can come to our school. So, you know, I've only worked in schools that were truly need blind, but you didn't have to file any financial aid forms to do the admissions application. But some schools do require that, unfortunately. I don't agree with it. It's my middle soapbox for the night. But talk to the school, find out, you know, if I don't file the CSS profile, will that hurt my child's chances of getting into the school? I would have mentioned names. You know, you'd say, yes, you know, my child's a sophomore, go that route. And they're looking at colleges. Do I have to file financial aid forms to be considered for a merit-based scholarships? Unfortunately, some schools will make you know, file the forms first. Yes?
Under the institutional aid, like merit awards or whatever, if a student is gonna continue, say, a language in college, would that fall under merit or is that separate?
What was that, they continue?
Under merit awards,
Yes.
institutional aid, like if say that the student's gonna continue studying a foreign language, whatever, and they're gonna give merit money, is that under that category, or would that be considered a separate category?
It's usually part of the whole merit. They look at the high school picture as a whole. whether they look at test scores, if not test scores, the GPA, the course requirements, the strength of the schedule to determine the merit awards. Once they're in college, it almost doesn't matter. That scholarship's going to be based on meeting a certain grade point average to continue. Some scholarships may be specific. If you're going for, say, nursing, your child's getting a nursing scholarship, they start to become, an education major, that scholarship can be lost because they're no longer a nursing scholarship, nursing student. But most initial merit scholarships are based for the school, not for a specific major, unless, in certain circumstances it might be. That's usually an additional type of scholarship. I believe that is the last.